Base Through Rocket is a format with degeneracy at its forefront, so because of this, not everyone is going to appreciate its intricacies and cutthroat gameplay. Known for very oppressive cards like Muck and Dark Vileplume, this is a very hard format to be acquainted with. However, if you're a fan of these cards like I am, this is one of the best formats to play in the Base Through Gym era and has something really special to offer. Although this is truly the start of the downfall, so to speak, of the WotC era, where trainer cards are way more powerful than any of the Pokemon available, this is still a very fun format if you know what you're doing. And here today, I'm going to be giving you a ton of decks to look at as I am ranking them in a tier list. So without further ado, let's go straight into it and let's break and shatter what was previously known about the meta, as we're going to be taking some previously mid-ranking decks and just straight up throwing them in the trash tier. Pure Stall and Wigglydoll are both finding themselves in the trash tier, and for a couple of reasons. So both of them suffer from the fact that Dark Vileplume is a major threat in this format, and Dark Vileplume's ability shuts off trainers entirely for both players. But decks that can't really pivot from a trainer focus are going to be the ones that suffer the most. And Wigglydoll, obviously, the way it sets up its bench for those massive do the wave attacks is through Clefairy and Mysterious Fossil, and both of those are trainer cards. They count as Pokemon once they're in play, but in order to play them, they are first trainer cards. So if Dark Vileplume's in play, you're SOL. And same with Pure Stall, it suffers from actually two things. So not only does it suffer from the Dark Vileplume, the fact that it mainly just plays 4 Chansey and then a bunch of trainer cards and typically not even any energy. So a Dark Vileplume in play pretty much shuts off well over 90% of your deck. It also suffers from the fact that Nightly Garbage Run gets introduced, which is a trainer card that makes it so you can shuffle 3 cards, 3 Pokemon or energy in any combination into your deck. Where sure, it's a trainer card, so Dark Vileplume would make it so you can't even use it, assuming that you're not in a situation where the Dark Vileplume's in play or your opponent has a way around it. The Nightly Garbage Run is going to make stalling a lot harder, and that's something we're going to see throughout this tier list, is that stall decks are not going to be in the position that they were prior to this set being released. Now let's move on to the casual tier, which has seen some changes, as it is now known as the casual tier instead of the non-competitive tier. If you've been seeing my other tier list, which if you haven't, you can see them here, but the casual tier more or less has the same heart as the non-competitive tier. It is a tier of decks that aren't completely terrible, but really decks that you probably shouldn't take to tournaments, and maybe something you should leave at home with your friends. And we're going to fill out that casual tier with 4 decks here. Alright, so in the casual tier, starting off, we have a new deck at the bottom here with Hypno Wave. So this is Wigglytuff meets Dark Hypno, and both of them have the advantage of being able to put your opponent's Pokemon to sleep. However, Dark Hypno has some serious drawbacks. So first, Dark Hypno has 60 HP, which is something that we see a lot with Dark Pokemon, is that they have really low HP. It was something that they were sort of messing around with. The Dark Pokemon are supposed to have better attacks and lower HP. It's the quote-unquote balance of the card design. However, the stronger attacks isn't always true. The Dark Hypno does have some decent attacks. For 1 Psychic Energy, it does 20 damage, and then for 2 Psychic and a Colorless, it has the potential to do 100 damage based on your opponent's bench as opposed to your own, which is sort of counterintuitive to the deck's idea and main strategy. However, I think that the thought is still there, as since you're going to be building up your bench, it makes sense for your opponent to build up theirs as well. And of course, because of this, you'd be playing the Dark or the Team Rocket Drowsy, which has an ability that lets you put your opponent's Pokemon to sleep, so you don't even have to rely on your Jigglypuff or Wigglytuff to do so. It is a very cool deck, however, I don't really think that it is good enough, and not really something to ever really consider playing, as though, or although it is a fun strategy. Dark Hypno, it's weak to Psychic. Wigglytuff resists Psychic, so you have some good counterbalance there. However, Mewtwo is still running rampant in this format, as well as a couple other Psychic threats, but it's just not really a deck that I personally see being any higher than this. I don't think it's trash by any means, otherwise I would have put it in that tier, but I don't see it ever being in a higher tier than this. And I think if through testing, it's just not going to find itself in a good spot. Next up, a huge downgrade from its previous spot. We have Miltris. So Miltris was previously in tier 2, and now it's seeing itself all the way down in the casual tier. And that is mainly because of Dark Bioplume again and Nightly Garbage Run. These two cards are single-handedly putting control in check, and Miltris really suffers from it, as it doesn't really help a mill strategy when a new card comes out that lets you shuffle cards from your discard into your deck. And Miltris typically would win through milling, but very tightly. So it would be just a few cards ahead of your opponent as far as your deck space, or your deck left, I suppose. And on top of that, Miltris plays a ton of trainers, as well as a lot of energy, but those trainers are really how it survives. And with Dark Vileplume in play, it makes it a lot easier to get knockouts on the Moltres itself, as well as the Slowbros if you're playing that variant. And next up, the biggest fall from grace, in my opinion, is the Tier 2 deck, Alakazam or Damage Swap. And it's been in tier 2 or even tier 1 throughout all of these tier lists, and now we're seeing it all the way down in casual. And that's because Muck is actually a much bigger threat than it was in the previous format. Whereas Muck was released in Fossil, it didn't really start seeing a lot of play until Base through Rocket, as there were more decks that were able to take advantage of it. And this is a deck where once Muck is in play, you are completely dead in the water. And as well as that, it is also a Sol deck and plays a lot of trainers. So Dark Vileplume, Nightly Garbage Run, all of these cards just spell the end of the Damage Swap era, where Damage Swap was never the best deck in format. It was always a contender. And it really sucks because it did get some new help with a higher HP Abra. It's just not nearly enough to keep it from being in the casual tier. However, as you see, I do have it towards the top, and that is mainly because if you can avoid those threats, it's still going to be a pretty good deck, but unfortunately, most of the meta is going to be running at least one of those three cards. And then last in the casual tier, we have Spooky Porter, which is a combination of Dark Alakazam and the Haunter from Fossil, which the Haunter from Fossil has a sort of baby rule ability, which makes it so that if any of your opponent's Pokemon would attack it while it's in the active, they have to flip a coin, and if it fails, the attack doesn't go through. In the Dark Alakazam, its main attack switches it out of the active and brings out one of your bench Pokemon. So you can constantly switch between the Dark Alakazam and the Haunter, as the Haunter has free retreat. It's actually a really cool deck, and something that I feel like probably could have been really good if it weren't for the fact that they really didn't do a good job of designing the Dark Pokemon. A stage 2 with low HP is really out of the question for competitive viability. And also the fact that, again, psychic weakness is never a good thing in this format. So it's tough to see, but at the top of casual, we do have the Spooky Porter deck. And with that, we're moving on to Rogue. In the Rogue tier, we have a couple of new faces and quite a few familiar ones. So at the back here, we have Pidgeot Imposter Oak. So Pidgeot's whole thing is its Hurricane attack, which puts your opponent's active Pokemon and all cards attached into their hand, unless it knocks it out, of course, because it does 30 damage. However, with the combination of Imposter Oak's Revenge, you can potentially get rid of all of those cards, except for, of course, the basic Pokemon that it's sent away. So assuming that you can use this on a stage 1, stage 2, then you're going to be able to really put them off of their main strategy. And I think that this is a pretty good control deck, but not nearly good enough to see itself in a higher tier. It's kind of gimmicky, And it does have some really big benefits, as Pidgeot has free retreat, it resists fighting, and the fighting resistance isn't a huge deal. In fact, it has a lightning weakness, which in this format is a much bigger problem. I still think that this deck has some merit and some grit behind it. That warrants it being in the rogue tier as opposed to the casual tier. Although it definitely is on the border, just like Spooky Porter, it could go either way. But personally, I think I would put it in rogue tier as I have. Next, we have a couple of Bazap decks. We have Bazapdos, which was in the rogue tier last time in the jungle tier list, but it is still a good deck. It's still very fast, but it's not really doing the things that it wants to be doing anymore, as there are decks that can set up faster. There are decks that cover more weakness. It's not that it's necessarily a bad deck, it's just that there's decks like a lot of decks that are better than it now. And that's sort of the same case with Buzzap Executor, which I'm actually going to move down one because the Buzzap Executor suffers from a symptom of this format, which is Dark Vileplume being at the forefront, makes it that fire decks are going to be a lot better, which means there's going to be more fire decks represented in the format, which means that Executor is going to have a much harder time sticking around and surviving. Next, we have Kanganite, which was also here in the last tier list. Kanganite doesn't really see any new buffs or debuffs. The only thing it really gets is the nightly garbage run in the event that your Dragonairs, Dragonites, Dratinis, any of the combo pieces or, any of the pieces to that line get sent to the discard pile. You have nightly garbage run to get them back. And I mean, maybe you could play this with the Dark Dragonair to be able to set up your Dragonites much more effectively. Then maybe rely on Breeder a little bit more. There's a couple of things you can do with this deck to help spice it up, but pretty much no matter what you do, I think it will still be in the rogue tier. And the other new face we see is Dark Raichu, or Rockets Raichu. So this is a spread deck. On a coin flip, it can do either 10 damage to all of your opponent's bench Pokemon, 20 damage to all of your opponent's bench Pokemon, or, of course, no damage. But no matter what, it will always do 30 damage to your opponent's active for 3 lightning energy. And it is a very good attacker. I messed around with this a little bit in the progression series, but I saw no success with it. And I don't necessarily think that is a reflection of how good the deck can be, more so a reflection of my own capabilities and the problems of playing in a limited format. But I think Dark Raichu is definitely a deck that can succeed in this format and do pretty well. It's not a deck I would necessarily see topping any tournaments. And last, we have, again, one of my favorite decks in the base through gym era. This is Rager, and it actually does get a pretty significant buff here. It gets Rainbow Energy, which you don't really need to play Rainbow Energy, as both of your Ragers are colorless Pokemon. Rainbow Energy does 10 damage to whatever Pokemon you attach it to, which makes that rage damage do a little bit more, which is just a really nice touch to the deck and not something that you necessarily have to play, but can be a way to sort of buff the aggressive nature of this deck. And I think that this deck is still something that needs to see a lot more testing, and I would really love to see how it performs in a tournament setting. But with that, we are moving on to anti-meta, and this tier is packed. So at the back here, we have Rapidash, Haymaker, and again, this deck isn't in a bad spot by any means. It's really just kind of the fact that it has to set up a stage 1, and whereas there are decks in this same tier that have to set up higher tier or higher stage Pokemon, it's just the fact that Rapidash doesn't really hit the numbers that you're necessarily looking for right off the bat. Of course, if you're dealing with Dark Vileplumes, I believe it hits almost perfectly, so just a couple plus power will do it. It's a good deck for sure in this format if you're going against grass decks or decks that play Dark Vileplume. However, I would probably say that otherwise it would have been in the casual tier. But again, there are just Dark Vileplumes running rampant, so the fire is definitely going to be very helpful. Next, you have Buzzap Arcanine, which, similarly to Buzzapdos, it's really been pushed out of the meta from the fact that there are just much faster and more aggressive decks in the format, but it plays a fire Pokemon, so it's really going to be useful in this format. Next, we have the return of Zardmaker. Zardmaker, I believe, last time found itself in the non-competitive tier, or now the casual tier, but with the introduction of Dark Charizard, we see a much bigger representative, a much higher representative, with it being able to deal a ton of damage with very little energy. For 2 fire energy, you can potentially do 100 damage. Of course, with that being said, if you do 100 damage, you don't have to discard those 2 fire energy. But 100 damage pretty much knocks out any of the big threats in this format, as Chansey is trash, and the other Charizard would have been the only other 120 HP Pokemon. Isn't even in the format, really. I mean, it's below trash at this point. Then we have Meditate. Meditate is still in a really good spot, as it doesn't rely on Mr. Mime's ability. Energy removal is really starting to take a backseat approach. Most decks are only playing a 2-3 split now, as opposed to the previous 3-4 split. So there's much less energy removal in the format, which is a really good thing, which is why we see the boost in this deck going from rogue to anti-meta. And whereas, sure, there's not as many Pokemon with high HP, especially in a format with dark Pokemon that traditionally have very low HP, it doesn't really matter, as this deck can deal with pretty much anything, and that's why it finds itself in anti-meta. Next, we have Sinkhole, which focuses on Drowsy and Dark Gloom, as well as Dark Doug Trios. So this is a deck that pretty much gets shut out by Dark Vileplume, and could arguably be in a lower tier, but I think it fits well here, as Drowsy and Dark Gloom can really help put on that pressure to make your opponent's Pokemon asleep or confused. And then you have the Dark Doug Trio, which does damage if your opponent tries to retreat, which of course they're going to try to do if they're confused. And there are a lot of free retreaters in this format, especially once we get to those higher tiers. So I think it earns its spot in anti-meta, but I could definitely understand the argument of it not belonging here. And the same kind of goes for Eeveetron, which does get a pretty big boost here, although it gets the promo card Eevee, which has the chain reaction ability, which anytime you evolve one of your Pokemon, you can search for a Pokemon that evolves from Eevee and evolve it. So you can pretty much evolve all of your Eevees in one go, as long as you have one single Eevee evolution in your hand. It also gets the buff of Rainbow Energy, which really helps with the potpourri style gameplay that it has of playing all of the evolutions and trying to hit as many weakness coverages as you can. Next, we have Duck Drought, which maintains its spot, partially because of the fact that energy removal is slowly starting to leave the format, which makes it so the Pokemon that have it built into them are in a better spot, but also it's a control deck that doesn't rely on abilities or trainers, really. So it really benefits from the fact that Dark Vileplume and Muck are in the format, because it's not really affected by either of them. And the same kind of goes for Controltress. No abilities, no trainer reliance, really. I mean, you do play a lot of trainers, but you're not reliant on them. You're mainly relying on your Pokemon, and where sure this is probably the last format where it will find itself in anti-meta, because Psyduck is immediately power crept by Dark Vileplume. It also benefits from the fact that it only plays basic Pokemon, so it can really set up the control a lot quicker than decks that play the Dark Vileplume or Muck. And then last but not least, the top of anti-meta is Mudactyl. Still a really good deck, as sure, the ability of Aerodactyl could potentially be shut off by Muck, but they'd have to evolve into it, which if you have your Aerodactyl in play, they can't. As well as the Mew, which can devolve Pokemon, so your Dark Vileplumes aren't going to be a concern anymore as long as you have your Mew in play. Alright, now we're going to be getting into the more competitive and reliable decks here in Tier 2. At the back of Tier 2, we have Smelly Dragon, which is Dragonite paired with Dark Vileplume, and of course, Dark Vileplume is the meta threat we've been talking about all video. Now, what's really interesting about this is this deck has a built-in way to deal with the trainer lock on itself, while still imposing the trainer lock on your opponent, which is unique to this deck. As far as I know, there's no other deck that can do this, but what it does is, while it has a single Dark Vileplume in play, it'll have Dark Glooms in play as well. So you set your Dark Vileplume to the active, and then you make it confused with your Dark Gloom. And once that is done, you can go through your turn playing the trainers that you need to. And then once you're ready to end your turn, all you have to do is use your Dragonite's ability to step in and switch your Dark Vileplume out of the active. And why this works is Dark Vileplume's Hay Fever ability only works if it isn't affected by a special condition, much like the other abilities in this format. As soon as you're paralyzed, asleep, or confused, the ability stops working. And that is the case with Dark Vileplume. And once you bring it back to your bench, then it starts working again because you get healed from your status condition. So whereas this deck doesn't really have a high damage output, it is really good at controlling the game state with Dark Vileplume and when it chooses to use it and how often it can make it so that it is unaffected by its own Dark Vileplume. Then we have the return of VenuCenter, which this is long overdue. I think this is probably one of my favorite decks in all of base through gym. Is Venusaur as well as Bulbasaur are my favorite Pokemon ever. And it's really nice to see that it, as a deck, is back in the forefront of the meta. I mean, it's not quite tier 1, and it never, I don't think, ever was or ever will be, but it sits comfortably in tier 2 towards the back of it, and that is largely thanks to the inclusion of Rainbow Energy and the ability of energy absorption. So with Mewtwo and Rainbow Energy, you can use its energy absorption for a Rainbow Energy instead of a Psychic, but then you can power it up with Grass Energy and then move that Grass Energy with Venusaur and, keep that damage output going with Kangaskhan and Venusaur. This deck is really only up here because of the fact that energy removal is seeing a backseat, like we mentioned before, but it also benefits from Nightly Garbage Run, as if your Bulbasaur or Ivysaur get knocked out early, you can cycle them back in and still set up your Venusaurs. It's a really fun deck, and I think this is probably the most fun that VenuCenter ever is, with the Kangaskhan and Mewtwo lineup instead of the Chanseys. Really interesting deck. Unfortunately, it doesn't really have a great way to deal with Dark Vileplume or even Muck, but it is still a really fun deck, and maybe it's a bit of bias. It probably could be an anti-meta, but I personally think it deserves its spot here. Next, we have another fall from grace. We have Lickitung Stall, which suffers from Muck, as Mr. Mime's ability isn't going to be able to put out, or isn't going to be able to stop damage as much as it would like if Muck is in play, making it so that Lickitung is really your only stall option. So this deck definitely still has merit, but it is no longer in tier 1, and I don't think it will ever get past tier 2 from here on out. And then we have Mag Marcanine, which saw its renovation in the last format, which was based through Fossil, with the promo Arcanine, which has a sort of rage attack, and it gets even better because of Rainbow Energy, because you can put that extra 10 damage on there. And once again, you're hitting weakness on Dark Vileplumes, on the Venusaur, any of the grass decks out there, or decks that utilize grass Pokemon. However, we do have it behind Rain Dance, naturally, because Rain Dance is basically just an immediate wall to this deck. And Rain Dance really doesn't see any new benefits outside of Nightly Garbage Run, being able to shuffle your water energy back, but more often than not, you'd rather just use energy retrieval. It does get Dark Blastoise, which you can run as a one-of with Pokemon Breeder, which has a much stronger Hydro Cannon attack, which can one-shot any Haymaker, given that it has enough water energy attached. But otherwise, this deck, it's not in tier 1 anymore, which is really kind of sad, but it's because it's been power crept out of the meta. It's still in tier 2, still a very viable deck for sure, but just doesn't have the utilities to deal with meta threats as well as it used to. And then we have the renovation of Clefable, now running Muck and Mewtwo with the power of Rainbow Energy, and generally just kind of being better and more refined in this format. It doesn't really see a whole lot of boosts. It sees the same number of boosts as pretty much any deck in this format does, but it is still a really good deck, and the Muck is just such a powerhouse against other decks that are running abilities. Wigglybuzz also finds itself near the top of tier 2 here. Again, falling from grace a little bit. It was in tier 1, and now it finds itself in tier 2. Not for any particular reason, it's just not as strong as a lot of the decks in tier 1 are. And last but not least, in tier 2, we have what I call Fetch Fever, but otherwise it is Kangaskhan, Dark Vileplume, and Alakazam. Kangaskhan being your main attacker, with Dark Vileplume setting up that oh so infamous Trainer Lock, and Alakazam damage swapping to make sure that your main attacking Kangaskhan stays strong. The deck really is just probably the best Vileplume user. It just draws so many cards through running pretty much all draw supporters, and of course Kangaskhan being a draw supporter of its own. It has really high damage output at a potential of 80 every turn, but for the most part, it's not an impossible deck to deal with. It's just really annoying and definitely can go toe to toe with some of the tier 1 decks, but isn't quite at that same level. But speaking of tier 1, this is our last tier, as once again, there are no tier 0 decks in the base through rocket format, so let's get into it. And in tier 1 at the back, we have Electabuzz, Mewtwo, which is one of the 2 Haymaker variants, or pure Haymaker variants, that are here in tier 1. Both Electabuzz Mewtwo and Electabuzz Magmar are really good because they cover a lot of weaknesses, but don't really have anything that hits them for weakness, or have anything that resists them. Of course, Mewtwo does have a lot of the normal Pokemon that resist it, which is why it is at the back of tier 1. And then Magmar, of course, suffers from the fact that, Rain Dance exists and Potpourri. But for the most part, these 2 decks are basically in the same spot now. They're both really good. They're the classic Haymaker, so they set up fast. They are very aggressive, but there are a lot more decks, or a lot more variety in the strategy and the decks available in this format than there were previously. So Haymaker is kind of at its last leg of dominance here. We have my favorite deck specifically in the base through rocket format, which is Snorlax, or as I like to call Thick Pollen, as it focuses on Snorlax and Dark Gloom. It does typically play a Dark Vileplume as well, but kind of have to be careful on when you use it, so I consider the partner Pokemon to just be the Dark Gloom, as you can set up multiple Dark Gloom, make it so that your opponent's Pokemon gets confused without fail, because your Snorlax can't be confused. So even if you fail your coin flip, nothing happens to Snorlax, and eventually you'll confuse your opponent's Pokemon. And this deck is just really oppressive because it plays Scoop Ups, it plays Mr. Fuji's, the Pokemon Centers. The only downside is you really don't have a way to deal with opposing Dark Vileplume, but surprisingly and luckily, this is really the only deck that uses Dark Vileplume in the top tier. So you really just have to worry about lower tiers that are running the Dark Vileplume, and it's also just such a big body and hard to kill. I just love this deck. It's very oppressive, very dominant. It's a very annoying deck to go against, but if you're playing it, then it's a lot of fun. And then we have Potpourri, which I don't show it here in the picture, but got a huge buff with the Rainbow Energy, of course, allowing you to pretty much run any Pokemon, any type of Pokemon that you want. There's another variant that I chose not to include that is a Buzzsap Potpourri, but I feel like it was way too gimmicky, and whereas according to J-Class, it's a top deck, I really don't see it being the case. Of course, I am nothing compared to J-Class, but this is my tier list, so I chose to just include the regular Potpourri. If you want to, sub this out for the Buzzsap Potpourri. Either way, it's pretty much the same. Just the idea of hitting as many weaknesses as possible and being able to flow in and out of your Pokemon as you please. And last but not least, we have the top of tier 1, the most dominant deck in this format, and one that I honestly did consider putting in tier 0 because of how oppressive it is, but chose not to, is Wigglytuff Sneak Attack. This deck runs the Mankey and the Rattata, which allows you to sort of pick your prizes as you please, knowing what they are, which is kind of crazy. And then it runs, of course, Wigglytuff with its Do the Wave and Rocket Sneak Attack. So this again is a deck that struggles to deal with Dark Vileplume. However, I think Wigglytuff being able to do tons of damage will pretty much cycle through whatever your opponent's trying to do, but typically you're going to be able to keep them off of the Dark Vileplume via Rocket Sneak Attack and Imposter Oak's Revenge. It is a very powerful deck, and this isn't even its final form. In Base Through Gym, we'll see it get even stronger as a little bit of a teaser there, and I'll be doing a tier list on that too. So once I put that out, be sure to check it out. But I hope you guys enjoyed this tier list. Base Through Rocket is one of my favorite formats, as well as like all of the formats in Base Through Gym are just really awesome. But Base Through Rocket is special to me because Team Rocket is my favorite set of all time. So it's really cool to see some of those Pokemon in play. But yeah, hope you guys enjoyed. And if you did, please leave a like, maybe subscribe. If you have anything that you think should have been said in this video, or any decks that you think should have been here, shouldn't have been here, leave a comment too. I'd love to hear about it, and I will get back to you on that. Hope you have a good day. See ya.